Welcome to the Fear and Courage podcast, where we tell stories of military veterans, law enforcement officers, and first responders. These careers are intense and in many ways foreign to the majority of people. We tell stories with intensity, dramatic personal impact, high physical and emotional stress, and lives changed as a result of the career service. Thanks for listening. Today we come back for part 2 of my talk with Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Howell. As a reminder, Lieutenant Colonel Howell is a native of Beaumont, Texas, and was commissioned as an infantry officer for the United States Military Academy in 2002. He's a graduate of the Infantry Officer Basic Course and Advanced Courses, as well as the College of Naval Command and Staff. He's married to Stephanie, and they have 5 daughters. His notable assignments include Platoon Leader in 10th Mountain Division, Platoon Leader and Company Executive Officer in 2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, Company Commander in 3rd Brigade, 1st Infantry Division, Assistant Operations Officer for the 75th Ranger Regiment, Company Commander in 1st Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, and Battalion and Brigade Operations Officer for the 173rd Infantry Brigade Combat Team. Lieutenant Colonel Howell has 8 combat deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan and is currently serving as the J5 Interagency Branch Chief for the Joint Improvised Threat Defeat Organization and will take command of 321 Infantry, 1st Stryker Brigade Combat Team, 25th Infantry Division this summer. We'll pick up where we left off last week. But before that, I'll be releasing 2 episodes of the podcast this week. For the next episode, I interview Sam Dean. He's a former infantry officer and 2006 graduate of West Point and current U.S. congressional candidate for the 5th District of Texas. Welcome to the show. Yeah, so right before we broke, we were talking about, your missions on that first deployment, and which I think one of the important concepts is that I want to talk about, especially when we go into your command deployments, is what you brought up, the idea of the risk you assume when you go on missions, and it's not necessarily the risk of mission failure as much as it is the risk of casualties, the risk of the damage that you take in the process of getting the mission done. Because in that environment, it's tough to imagine really losing a fight. Like the definition of losing a fight versus winning a fight is a very different thing for you versus the enemy, because when you go out, you have so many assets to bring to bear.
Yeah, that's right. So, when it comes to managing risk, there's 2 aspects to look at it from. The first is the risk to mission, right? When what could happen that would prevent me from accomplishing my mission, and then how do I do things to mitigate that risk? And the other one is the risk to the force. How exposed and open are my people and are the force going to be? How many casualties could we expect to take, and how do you mitigate and protect against that? And so there's a balance that you've got to take, right? You're never going to sacrifice your guys to such a great extent to get the mission accomplished. But if you're only concerned about protecting your force, and then there's a chance you may not get your mission accomplished. And so finding that balance is key. And you've got to understand you're going to take casualties at times. And so what you want to do, though, is just like you said, I'm not going to lose a fight. I shouldn't lose a fight, and that was the mindset that I took, especially into the Korengal deployment. Is I've got the force, I've got the assets that I need to keep the guys protected. We need to always be in the position where we have those assets on hand, or they're close by, that we can bring them to implement if needed. So if we're going outside of artillery range, okay, if we're going outside of artillery range, do we move our own mortars? Do you have additional assets that are on station, either from a reconnaissance aspect or from a fires aspect, that you could bring in very quickly to help if you or your folks get in a tight spot.
Yeah, and when we talk about assets and things like that, we're talking about things that can shoot, things that can fly, things that can look, any kind of aircraft, Air Force and Army aircraft, fixed wing and rotary wing aircraft, artillery assets, mortars, basically anything that can shoot and look outside of what you've got, in your platoon or company at the time. Those assets are, and when you plan missions, you try and stack those assets based on what the threat is in order to balance that risk, like you were just talking about. But so that story you just told was a pretty intense early experience with risk management, the chaos of a fight, and just the craziness that can happen in a firefight with a child like that, just kind of hanging out there right in the middle of it for the entire thing.
Yeah.
Pretty mind blowing when you realize what actually happened in that little spot for that couple of days.
Yeah, but I mean that's the reality of it. I mean that's when you talk about combat and close, tough combat. I mean that's what it looks like, right? It looks like your friends or getting your soldiers assuming a tremendous amount of risk. There are civilians who have done nothing wrong. That are there caught in the middle, and the enemy is on the other end. And the frustrating piece is that he will use civilians as protection,
yep.
And certainly as a message. So if I'm a bad guy and I'm shooting at you from within a civilian population, and you retaliate or you over retaliate, then now he can talk back and use that as a point. Say, hey, look, these guys don't care about you.
He has a public affairs message on his hands right there that you just handed him.
Yeah, so that's the challenge that you try to balance, but I mean that's the reality of combat and what it looks like. And if you're there and you experience it, then you can take that with you as you move on. And if you don't have that experience, then it's certainly something that you want to impart on your guys that don't, right? And so whenever you train, you always want to make it as realistic as possible so that you're as prepared as you can be to react the way that you need to in those situations.
Yeah. And so after that deployment, you came home back to Fort Drum, New York, so typically an infantry officer's career timeline, they'll go to the unit that they're going to be a platoon leader in, and then they go to the captain's career course to learn how to be a company commander and staff officer, and then they go to the unit that they're going to command a company in, and that's kind of pretty regimented and organized by rank, the unit that you're a lieutenant in, then the unit that you're a captain in, and then you go on to another school and go be the unit that you're going to be a major in, and that's pretty normal. But you took a slightly diverted path over to the Ranger Regiment to go be a platoon leader and a executive officer from there, correct?
Yeah. So I was really fortunate. The timing worked out really well, where I was young enough, I had enough time before I had to go to the captain career course, to go over to 2nd Ranger Battalion at Fort Lewis in Washington, and so you go over there, and it's the whole new process, or it's the same process that you go through as a lieutenant.
Describe for a second what the difference is between just being a lieutenant in the Ranger Regiment in one of the Ranger battalions compared to in a conventional light infantry unit, if you can. That's another 3-hour discussion, but the minute and a half long version.
Sure. So, very, very broadly, it's the same type of organization that you'd have in a regular infantry company and a battalion. The numbers are a little different. A handful of the weapons are a little different, but the mission set is different. And so you're a special operations unit whose main role is as a raid force, and you're able to execute special operations missions where you have less of a U.S. footprint. You're able to move longer distances, but you're doing it with some of the very best, infantrymen, special forces units, aviators, logisticians in the military. And so the mission is similar to a standard infantry mission, but you're doing it against a different enemy a lot of times, in different circumstances, where you've got a little bit less support, and sometimes you're further out than normal conventional units would go.
Yeah. And there's a tryout process to get into the unit for every position at all levels, from the lowest level private all the way up to the regimental commander. Every time as an officer, you go back to the unit, you try out again every time. As a soldier, you have to try out to get in the first place, and then to come back as a non-commissioned officer leader, you have to try out again for those leadership positions. And so they can be selective. They can pick the people who are not just the most physically fit and physically capable, but also the most experienced and mentally and emotionally prepared for that mission and that fight as well. So their ability to be selective, as well as their funding and their their training kind of operational tempo puts them in a position where they can go out and they just have a greater capability, I guess.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And as we talked about wanting to prove yourself as a lieutenant coming out of Ranger School into your first unit, I mean it's the exact same thing here, but you're doing it with the very best officers and non-commissioned officers in the Army. And they're incredibly talented people. And my peers that were lieutenants and officers there. I mean, I knew them in school. I knew them in the basic courses. They're the very best guys. With an incredible amount of diverse experiences. I remember my first company commander. Man, you look at those guys as a lieutenant, all those company grade officers, and you look at them as gods.
Look like a superhero.
Yeah, they absolutely are. And so, you go through and you want to prove yourself again with your platoon sergeant and your guys knowing how good they are. But at the same time, I mean, you have some confidence coming in. You're like, hey, I made it through. I've got experience. I've got combat experience.
They picked me to be in this unit for a reason.
Right. Yeah. But there's still that initial pieces you're trying to overcome, trying to prove yourself, be the best lieutenant you can for your guys. And so you start kind of in that role, and then you grow over time as you get more experience, where you become a leader for that organization, and you have confidence, experience, and expertise, and you use that to help lead those organizations. And I was, I felt incredibly fortunate to be a platoon leader there in C Company in 275, and then later I was able to be the company's executive officer. And so, from there I did a deployment to Afghanistan in the summer of 2005, and then two more to Iraq up near the Mosul area, and then the second one was down closer to the Ramadi area. Where I had very different experiences in all three. In the first one, I was a platoon leader. Still, we had a quick reaction force and combat search and rescue mission for part of the time. The other part of the times we went out on missions throughout Afghanistan. And in Mosul, I got to be a ground force commander for one of our teams, executing raids in that area. And then in Ramadi, I was doing more of a as an XO, doing some targeting type of things. But my time in Afghanistan was interesting. We talked about that mission in the Pesh River Valley in Wagle and the Kunar area. I went back as a platoon leader there, and so in the summer of 2005, with Operation Red Wings, there was a special operations aircraft that got shot down. With members from a SEAL team, 10, I think it was SEAL Team 10, that was shot down, and so we went out and did the search and rescue on that. And I remember, our platoon, I think we were on our way to arrange to do some training. We were obviously on quick alert, and once we got word that the helicopter had been shot down, quickly came back. Did some quick planning pre-stage and were ready to go out. Weather unfortunately came in and rolled the mission 24 hours. So we went the next day. And so when we went in, that aircraft was shot down right on the mountain that's on the eastern side of the Korangal Valley in the Shuriak Valley, kind of in the southern south of the Pesh River Valley that runs kind of east-west. And so we went in the next night, did a long fast rope insert. This is funny. I remember. So based on where we're organizing the helicopter, as a platoon leader, I was towards the front of the helicopter, so that I could talk to the crew and everything, which meant I was the last one to come down the fast rope. Mm-hmm. And it was a long rope, and I remember looking down, and I was like, man, what is that down there? It was dark. There was very little illumination, and it looked like rivers. Like it looked like you were a couple hundred feet up in the air, and you're looking at this stream of rivers. I was like, that's not rivers. What is that down there? And as I got closer, I realized there are these enormous logs. And so timber farming is a really big deal in that area, and the trees are enormous up there. And it was a bunch of trees that had been cut down from the timber farmers up there. And so I remember we
And
we landed as the last one off the rope.
Fast roping, you can't exactly stop and make adjustments on the way down. You're attached to the rope by only your hands and feet, and you're sliding down a rope from a helicopter like a fireman's pole, dropping onto whatever you're dropping on.
Yeah, and you got to, and once you hit the bottom of the rope, you got to get out of the way, because the guy behind you is, a few feet above you.
That's a 60 to 90 foot rope a lot of the time too, so people aren't exactly. There's multiple people on the rope.
Do it at 5 feet.
Yeah.
But this one, because of the trees, we had to get above them. It was a pretty long rope, and I remember it felt like we were going forever. But that guy, I knew there was no one ahead of me, and we landed in these trees, and so everyone's kind of on top of each other and rolling and trying to get out of the way. But I knew I didn't have to move as quickly because there wasn't anyone behind me. What I forgot about though was that they cut the rope, and so the entire rope then fell and just landed on my head. So I'm like, this is great. Anyway, we moved up and we had an offset infill and then moved over the terrain up to the crash site, secured that, and then started the somber process of doing the recovery at this point. And so there was our ranger element and some a handful of other units that were up there to secure the site, and then to look for the SEAL team that had been in before with Marcus Luttrell and those other guys. We knew they'd had a fight now 2 days before, and that some of the enemy were trying to get their hands on them. And so there was a kind of a dual process mission of securing that site, and then trying to find those guys. There wasn't much fighting going on when we were there, I think, because of the size of the force, and so there were a couple of very small firefights and some kinetic strikes and things that were going on. And then again, that somber process of securing those folks in the crash site. And my sister platoon was the one that actually had gone down. I think it was in the Shuriak Valley, in one of the villages up there on the mountain, and where Luttrell was, and had secured him. I was off. We were searching in different areas, but one of the missions we had was down in the Korengal Valley, and we had to do some exploitation of a site that had been struck. And I went down there and we interviewed a lot of the Korengalis about what had happened and the enemy in the area, and everything. And I remember very distinctly some of these guys. They dye their hair with henna. It's very red. I mean, it looks like you've gone back in time 1,000 years.
Beards look almost similar to mine.
Yeah, that's right. But anyway, we talked to these folks for a period of time, and the reason I'm going into detail now is going back 3 years later as a company commander. The village that we were next to was Chichal, and we had a patrol base. It's essentially where Firebase Vegas was on the eastern side of the valleys, where our patrol base was at the time. But I remember going back there as a company commander, and I'm like, hey man, I remember you.
Yeah.
Like, I talked to you 3 years ago, on the other side over there, and there's, oh yeah, no, we remember. But it was weird, you talk about, the Army and people, and you keep kind of coming back and seeing the same thing sometimes. It was a very surreal experience for me to go back and own that battle space, where we were before. But
Speak to one thing, village elders, and that's crazy. That's crazy.
Yeah. But one thing I do want to say about that is, that experience and so many others, about how incredible those people are, that you're working with, and your fellow Rangers, man. It's an incredible group of people. Folks go there and you go to serve, but you feel like you take so much. I feel like you take so much more away than you give, right? And so you're always kind of struggling to help, bring as much good as you can in the organization, because you know how much you're taking back. It's just an incredible group of people to work with.
Yeah, and I think you made it through that story without actually saying the words "lone survivor."
I did.
That's for reference, that Operation Red Wings and up on the Abu Scar and that ridge line on the the eastern side of the Korengal Valley. That was the operation that was then eventually written about and turned into the movie Lone Survivor. And that's a rough place. We'll get into this in a second when we talk about you going back to the Korengal Valley as a company commander. But that's a rough place in every way you could possibly think of that kind of definition. The people are rough, the culture is rough, the terrain is rough. It can be a very bleak place from the perspective of an outsider.
Yeah. And from a tactical standpoint, I mean that episode, it's guys are putting it out there on the line in order to try to accomplish the mission, but you can see what the enemy is capable of, and the amount of damage they're able to inflict. And it's it's something that we struggled with for the whole year that we were there, is how to balance all that. And the enemy up there, they can fight.
And their command of the terrain is unmatched, I would say.
Yeah, well, I mean, think about it, Michael, where you grew up, right? And so if you stayed in your neighborhood where you grew up, and you and all your friends went out, and you were going to fight somebody, man, you knew every place to go, you knew every rock to go to, you knew where to hide things. Your ability to navigate and run circles around folks up there would be unmatched.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, that's really what you're
the
with.
spot to jump over the fence where you can make it over, and like all that little stuff, like the guy in your buddy's backyard, like that's the spot to jump his fence. And you're dealing with that in every single instance. You're fighting people in their backyards in an environment that's already pretty rough. So for you, from there, from the Ranger Regiment, like we mentioned earlier, you go to the captain's career course, and then you go to the unit that you're going to be a captain in, that you're going to be a company commander in. And that's the first point in your career where our paths crossed, going to 3rd Brigade, 1st Infantry Division, and taking company command there.
Yeah, so that was an interesting time. Like leaving the Ranger Regiment, I felt like I understood what I needed to do to be a company commander. I understood fighting. You get to see some of the very best company commanders in the Army, and you emulate their style and figure out what works for you and what doesn't. So I wanted to take as much as I could from that experience in the Ranger Regiment, plus everything from 10th Mountain Division and everything you get from mentors, and kind of take that with you as you go in to assume command. We had a very interesting experience, I'd say, with that, because as the battalion had.
Well, I'll give a little bit of perspective on this, because this is a time in the Army when the Army was frantically, the United States government was frantically trying to address the requirements of the conflicts that we were in, and reconcile that with assets available to deal with those conflicts. And so, at the time, the Army was standing up brigades of people, infantry brigades and armor brigades, and a brigade is 5,200 or so people. And so standing up a brigade is no small task. And the way that the Army does that is they try and get some leaders in to create kind of a skeleton crew of a built-out brigade, where at least the leadership is in there, and as you start to populate the unit, you start to pick up normal training tasks, because you have to populate that unit with people, then you have to populate that unit with equipment and vehicles and weapons, and you have to find a place to put them on a base that previously didn't have a brigade there. And so our situation was one of those. The Army was standing up a brigade on a base that didn't have space for them, on a base that wasn't purpose-built for that kind of unit. And so we were in a deployed units barracks buildings and a deployed units office buildings at the time that we knew we're not going to be a permanent home. And we had a deployment on the schedule in the future.
Yeah, and you're trying to come in and manage with all those, deal with all those problems. You're trying to build a culture and a mindset. You're just training your butt off, trying to get ready for the fight. I remember that for the longest time we thought we were going to. Well, we didn't know we were going, but we thought we were going to Iraq because it made the most sense. And so when I'd left Iraq in the end of '06, and then we were there in springtime of '07, spring and summer of '07, setting up this unit. I thought that's where we were going. And I remember about a year or so out, as you're bringing everybody together, man, asking myself, man, I don't know if we're ready for the Iraq fight, because it was no joke.
That was the time of explosively formed projectiles, EFP, IEDs, and there was some pretty heavy fighting going on in all arenas in the '07, '08 timeframe.
Yeah, and I was taking with me kind of my perspective from the '06 timeframe, and things had started to change in Iraq, largely because of the tribes that started to turn out in Fallujah and Ramadi, in that area. Also coincided with the time of the surge, and so things switched for us. And I don't know how the decision was made or what to slot us into the Afghanistan rotation, but we got slotted for the Afghanistan rotation. And my Afghan experience was, everything that we've talked about. There was some fighting going on, but we talked about the way that we could walk through the Pesh River Valley, and so that's kind of the mindset I had of what it was going to be like. And compared to that or places that were still pretty dicey in Iraq, it was tough to bring the team together, because going into an organization that's not standing up from scratch, it's easier just to kind of get there, right, to a standard.
There's some people that have been around for a little while that have some institutional knowledge. There's civilians that are attached to the unit that, in some cases, there are civilians that have been attached to a unit for 10 years, and so they carry some institutional knowledge. And you find some senior non-commissioned officers who've been there for 4 or 5 years and who are on the last deployment. Whenever you come into a new unit in the military, especially for this last 15 years, there's always this crew of people who were on the last deployment, who carry forward with them that experience, some of the unit culture, and those people tend to be pretty competent. Otherwise, the unit might not have them stick around as often, and so you tend to get a core group of people in a unit that were on the last deployment, that have some of the unit culture they bring with them, that have some institutional knowledge, that have some experience in their jobs in the Army. And when you stand up a new unit, you just don't have any of those people. You don't have any of those people. Come from other places, but they don't have any unit history. Nobody when they show up identifies with that unit yet. And so you have a whole group of people who are kind of in that spot instead of the normal setup.
Yeah, and I liked having the ability to kind of shape that culture and that mindset from anew, right? But it brings its own challenges. I mean, you were a platoon leader for me at that part, and it was hard. I know it was for you guys and for us to try to build that kind of from scratch, right? And we had a lot of young guys. I mean, there's a whole basic training class that felt like kind of came in, and
private
as the
first
Army
class
is
team leaders.
taking. Yeah. As the Army is taking guys from all over trying to build these units, they're filling guys fast. And we had good folks, but we it takes time to get everything ready. So, I had that mindset for what Afghanistan was going to be like based on my experience. And then once we started to hear a little bit more about where we were going, I'm like, man, I've been to Kunar province before. I've been up there a couple of times, and so I know what the terrain is going to be like. And so we try to get ready from that perspective, but then we started to hear more about what the battalion we were replacing is going through. Second Battalion of the 503rd, part of the 173rd in Italy, was the battalion that we were replacing, and there were a handful of articles that had come out. I'd obviously remembered my experience from the Red Wings and the damage those folks could do up there. But there was the New York Times article, the Vanity Fair article. I remember one specifically, "Battle Company is out there," right? And I remember that was the title of the article. And they started to talk about how much fighting was going on up there, how difficult it was, the amount of enemy they were taking, the casualties that folks were taking. We talked earlier about that village of Aranis that in the northern portion of the Wagle that we had gone in Nuristan in I think December of 2003. It's where 2503 had the ranch house up there, and I think that article specifically talked about how the enemy had breached and was trying to overrun that small little outpost. And I remember thinking of that village, something like that, because you got all these. Again, you're back in time a couple thousand years with all these buildings stacked on top of each other. The ability for the enemy to move around and gain some advantage on terrain is significant. So, there was kind of an awakening of what we're really getting into, and what that fight's going to be like, and are we doing everything we can to be prepared for that? And so that was, I think I mean, you can tell me, Michael, from your perspective, what it was like figuring out, okay, here's where we're going. How ready folks thought they were. I remember going in, I felt like we were ready as we could be.
From our perspective, from our perspective, and to give the listeners an idea, you were a company commander and I was one of your platoon leaders, and we had 1 year to get ready for what we knew was coming as a deployment. And I want to say, 7-8 months out, we found out we were going to Afghanistan, and maybe 6 or 7 months out, we found out specifically where. So right around that National Training Center rotation, that the final big brigade training and certification, okay, you're ready for a deployment, at that National Training Center rotation at NTC in California, I remember constantly, that's when we realized, okay, that's when kind of the platoon leaders and the soldiers, we kind of realized, okay, we're going to the Pesh River Valley, to Kurnool Province. And specifically, we were Bravo Company and Battle Company 2503 was in the Korengal Valley. And so at NTC, that's when we realized, okay, we're going to the Korengal Valley. And then my platoon, first platoon, was the first platoon Battle Company 2503 was at Restrepo, and so I kind of realized as a platoon leader and my squad leaders, we're going to Restrepo, and there's no shortage of information at that point in time as to what was going on there. That was what seemed very strange to all of us, is that there's the unknown. This was going to be my first deployment. I was a 22-year-old, 23-year-old second lieutenant, first lieutenant. And I think I'd just been promoted to first lieutenant. And so we're getting ready for this deployment, and you expect there to be, there's all the unknown. I was going through that period you described earlier of wanting to be good enough, being worried about being good enough, being scared of the unknown of a deployment, and also wanting to stand in front of my platoon and look like the guy who was strong and in charge and capable. And then we got to watch in the news basically the battle space we were going to, and it was a weird experience seeing that kind of play out before you get there.
Yeah, it definitely is. I think it weighs on everyone's mind. As a company commander, my first thought was, okay, I've got to do everything we can to make sure that we're ready for it. That changes, with different levels of responsibility. From down to the private level, you're thinking, man, I just want to survive.
Don't want to piss off my squad leader.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Survive my squad leader first, then the enemy.
Yeah.
But I remember, when we first started to show up, or before we were leaving, you've got it's the same thing you have every deployment, right? You're eager, you're a little bit naive, you're optimistic, you want to,
you're
we're going to
aggressive.
go in, we're going to fight hard, we're going to win, we're going to do everything that we can, and you do that throughout. But there's just an unknown when you go into it initially, and you don't have a year's worth of things that are weighing on you, at the beginning portion. But I remember when we got into theater, right when we had gotten in, I don't remember if it was the day that we landed or a day or so before, but what not had just happened. And so because we were coming in, our previous unit, they were moving an outpost that was further north in the Wagle Valley, Bella was the name of the combat outpost. And this wasn't in my space, but this was in another company space. And they were moving it closer to Blessing, south in the Wago, closer to the Pesh River Valley. And they had wanted to get it stood up and ready before we got there, because whenever a unit comes, you don't have the experience. The unit that's there is so much better than you would be arriving and trying to stand up a combat outpost while coming into theater would be a little too much. So they were trying to get that thing stood up. And then there's obviously the whole battle about that. That I'm not going to go into, but
yeah,
that had just happened.
At the time, that was a huge deal. It was all over the news, and I remember. So this was July 13th, 2008, and at that point, I remember very specifically, I left Texas on July 5th, 2008, and so
Okay.
I was in Kyrgyzstan on the way in Afghanistan. You were at Blessing, correct?
I don't
Or
remember.
possibly at Asadabad, something like that. You were on the way in, or just having gotten there.
Yeah, I remember talking to Carter Cheek, who was another lieutenant who was going into this AO in Charlie Company. I remember talking to him. I think it was at Bagram about this, and his company commander. We just happened to be there at the same time, and so I remember talking to him about it, and saying, "Hey, listen, just when you get there, get ready for a fight. Work on patrolling, try to push out, gain space." But I remember talking to him specifically. I think it was at Bagram.
Yeah, and this fight we won't go deep into this fight, but essentially 200 Taliban insurgents very nearly successfully, and at points did successfully overrun a compound where a platoon, the position was primarily defended by one platoon of an infantry company, and effectively they broke the perimeter line. They overran about 3/4 of the compound, and 9 U.S. soldiers were killed, 27 were wounded, and it was a major fight, and one of the most public examples at that time of the real risk of an outpost actually being completely overrun by the enemy. And for many people up until that point in time, as a part of the greater U.S. Armed Forces, that wasn't really a risk that we had identified as much. Individual people on the ground in those environments realized that capability all along, or might have had some exposure to that. But up until that point in time, coming into a deployment, a platoon in the battle space that we were going into essentially was overrun in the process of us taking over that battle space.
Yeah, and it was certainly different. A different situation than anything I dealt with before, and so that's kind of forward in everyone's mind of that risk and the enemy's ability to fight that way. So anyway, it's certainly what you're thinking about going in, but again, you still go in and you're optimistic, you're eager, you know the situation. And you go in trying to learn as quickly as you can and do the best you can there, but then you quickly kind of get reality, right? Reality will kind of hit you in the face pretty quickly.
And in that place, it was on day one.
Yeah. And so the enemy was fighting us pretty hard early, but I'll talk the villagers' perspective, like. It's just, man, it's different. So the Korangalis, just a bit of a background on them, just challenging to deal with. So originally from Nuristan, had gotten the rumor and the legend was they'd gotten kicked out of Nuristan because they were so hard to deal with, and they such isolationists that they either left or had been kicked out and had established themselves in the Korangal. And they had been in charge of the timber trade there, and were really the big wigs. They had all the big trees, and were really kind of big wigs when it came to the timber trade. But they didn't like outsiders. They spoke their own language. They fought with neighboring tribes and villages and things like that. And they all believed a very fundamentalist. I don't know if fundamentalist is it's not the right word, but it was very similar to the Salafist ideology in Islam, and so our ability to make progress with them was challenged. I remember when I first came in, Dan Kearney, who I had ripped out with, was you go around with the guy that you replace, and he shows you everything, and he tells you about things, and we were talking about the villagers and how they were to deal with, and kind of current problems or what they cared about, and one of the things he was telling me about was there was a situation in the valley where there was a girl who was supposed to, somebody's son, but he was a Taliban fighter, and she didn't want to marry him. And so he goes, hey, just kind of keep, this is something that came up in the last couple of shuras. It's just something going on in the valley. You probably ask about it at some point. I'm like, okay.
Right. So they identified a risk of this girl marrying a Taliban fighter.
She didn't want to do it.
Gotcha.
Right. And so what we could have done about it, nothing.
The issue at hand is that she was planned to marry this Taliban fighter, and she was resistant to that idea.
Yeah, that's right. And how it got brought up to Dan, I'm not sure, or I don't remember. But so anyway, I remember, hey, I'll ask about this, at some point. So maybe a couple of weeks or so had gone by, and I asked the villagers, when you have these shuras, you have anywhere between 20 to 40 village elders from I don't know how many villages are actually in the Korengal. Maybe
it's like a town hall meeting, and everybody kind of gets their chance to hash out their issues.
That's right. And every village will send, so there's like a valley elder, and then each village has their own couple of representatives, from those senior families, and they come down. And so you talk about issues and ways to move forward as a community, et cetera. And so in this shura, I asked them, I said, hey, what happened to this situation? I remember there was a girl who was supposed to marry a guy who was a Taliban. She didn't want to do it. How is this being resolved? And they all they're all very proud that they'd resolved this issue. And we're like, oh, okay, that's great. What happened? And they go, we stoned her.
Shit.
And I said, excuse me? They're like, yeah. And they're all like shaking their heads, smiling, like, oh yeah, that was the best solution. We stoned her. And I remember thinking, like, how is this going to work? Like,
holy shit.
Yeah. Like, I mean, so you've got people that you're fighting, and that it's all of their sons that are the people up in the hills that you're fighting. And their belief system is so different than what the government of Afghanistan is trying to do, and trying to find ways to bring those together with a group of people that don't want you there, that have such an extreme ideology with the way that they believe. The valley elder that we spoke with, Haji Zawar Khan, the guy that he replaced, was currently the Kunar shadow governor for the Taliban, right? The religious leader for the valley was now the head of the Taliban in the valley. At some point late in the deployment, I was talking with Haji Zawar Khan, which is the spokesman for the valley, for lack of better terms, and he was talking about how nice this was like in an April timeframe or something, about how nice this lunch was we were having. We had invited them over, and we're trying to,
trying to get something done.
Well, I don't remember what the event was, but there was some event that we decided was a good idea, that we would cook. We would buy a goat. We would cook food. We'd invite them over, build relationships with them. And he was talking about how nice this was.
Sure.
And he goes, yeah, man, this is really. He didn't say that, because this is really nice. I remember doing the same thing with the Russians. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Man, I thought, like, you're putting this on the same, like, you think about the Russians, right? And from an American's perspective, you read about how they failed and how they were unable to build relationships with the elders and
you realize
the
you're
people.
Doing the exact same thing that they tried.
You realize that they look at you the exact same way they do. They looked at the Russians, and you're just like, man. So just dealing with them was incredibly.
Imagine as an American, you run into some issue with getting your car registered at the DMV. There's some problem with the little sticker that goes on your license plate, and your mom or your aunt comes to you and says, "Oh, how'd you deal with it?" "Oh, I burned the DMV down." It's like options that, solutions that you don't even consider as being on the map of possibilities come up in these discussions.
Yeah.
And so once that happens a couple of times, you realize you're in an environment where you need to be ready for anything, because anything is on the table. Any kind of point of view, any kind of solution, any kind of conflict is on the table at that point. And you also kind of get that you're not special to them in any way.
Yeah, I mean that's you've got to manage your expectations about what you can really get done, right? And so, I learned that a little bit more over time. I guess my strategy with them was to try to maintain relationships. My hope was that if a few of, because there were folks, especially some of the younger guys in the valley that did not believe as extremely and weren't supportive of some of the things that the elders were saying and doing and how they were supporting the insurgency, or at least that's what they led on to us. But they weren't in position to do anything about it. And so my strategy was to maintain relationships, try to foster things with the folks that were more supportive of what we wanted to do. And the hope was that if we were able to remove some of the more senior Taliban folks, there's a potential for change there, right? Yeah. To continue to show goodwill, be honest with them, try to merge them with the government as best we can. Ask governors and stuff to come out, that you at least have a relationship with them, while we were trying to, one, hold our ground, improve ground if able, in the Korengal, so it was a little bit more accessible. We'd really hoped to put a road in there so they could see the benefits of having better freedom of maneuver or movement up and down, and they could, increase potentially their any type of they didn't really have an economy. They had the timber trade, but it got shut down by the government, so they weren't really willing there. But to try to make things a little bit better, where they were more supportive.
And in many situations, you were navigating an American solution to an Afghan problem. You constant running into the wall of an American solution for an Afghan problem in a lot of cases. That I remember that road specifically, and we've talked about this a couple of times since, but that road got shut down. I mean, so I want to illustrate a couple of things. One, how isolated the Korengal Valley is, not just from the world, but the company, that military company, the army company that's in the Korengal Valley, how isolated specifically that company is from the battalion right outside the valley, and then also what a fight looks like in that kind of environment, because it's extreme terrain and extreme isolation. And so there are maneuver challenges as well. But can you describe a little bit about kind of what the geographic laydown of the company looked like in the valley, and what the fight was?
Sure. So the Pesh River Valley runs east and west, right? So perpendicular to the Pakistan border. And you talked about 20 kilometers or so from there. And so camp, I'm trying to remember. So the Korengal, I'm trying to remember the distances. The Korengal runs south off of the Pesh River Valley, and Camp Blessing and the rest of the battalion was stretched out, east,
probably
west, north of us.
3-4 kilometers up from the mouth of the Korengal Valley, I think, was about.
That's right, Blessing, and a little bit west, yeah. And so the rest of the battalion was organized, kind of east to west along that river valley with offshoots in different company areas. I remember C Company was north of Blessing into the Wagle Valley. Mm-hmm. A Company had the Waterpur Valley, which was, north and east of us, and was north, perpendicular to the Pesh River Valley. And then we were kind of in the middle of those, but to the south. And it's a valley. It's narrow. It's small. I remember talking to Kendall Clark, who was our S3, about. He's like, man, I remember the first time I flew into the Korengal, I was expecting this huge thing. It's tiny. It's a small little area. And we're maybe the first base, the Korengal outpost, is maybe I don't know, 10 or 20 kilometers, maybe. I
want to say 10 or 12.
Okay, that
sounds about right. And it was basically the road down the Korengal Valley. The road is on the west side of the valley, and the Abu Scar, and where the lone survivor and Operation Red Wings was on the east side of that valley, that ridge up there. And so that road basically was on the edge the west side of the valley and ran right into the Korengal outpost, which was the lumber camp in the center of the lumber trade in that area at the time.
Yeah, that's right. And so, on that road, you've got a mountain that goes up one side and a cliff that goes down the other. And there's no other roads. There's a footpath, several footpaths that are below, closer to the valley floor. And
one vehicle width.
Yeah, best. That's right. Yeah, that's right. And so, an American Humvee just fits, but nothing more. And so on the west side of the valley, we have a majority of our bases. The Korengal outpost is the biggest one, which is the company headquarters. Again, directly to the east is Firebase Vegas, which is in midway up the mountain. Everything else is on the west side. And I don't remember how long it takes. Several hours to walk.
I think it was like between a 4-hour walk, 5-hour walk between Firebase Vegas and the Korengal outpost. But from the Korengal outpost, you could look across the valley, and it almost feels like you could throw a football to Firebase Vegas.
Yeah, it's not too terribly far. It's a couple of kilometers.
That's an exaggeration, but it's only a couple kilometers away, but it's a 4 or 5 hour walk.
Yeah, so not within direct fire, but certainly well within indirect fire range. And then, so south of the Korengal, you've got there was a village immediately south of us, and we had one fire base there, Firebase Vimoto. And then a little bit further south, you've got where the valley, it's kind of like an inverted Y, right? It comes down and it splits. One portion of the valley goes southwest, and the other portion of the valley goes southeast. And so as it makes that turn, we've got a small little outpost. It's called Outpost Dallas. We have a squad there. It was the most awesome fighting position in the world, with a couple of heavy machine guns and claymores and Mark 19s and AT weapons. It was great. But from there is really where it got sporty. South of that position, when you would do patrols, because the enemy basically had their line, everything south of a grid line. We had kind of everything north, and then directly west and up the mountain from OP Dallas was where Restrepo was, on this piece of terrain that the Taliban had used to use to just pummel the Korengal outpost. When Battle Company 2503 was there, but they'd established a fire base on it. So
yeah, they basically put the OP there to take it away from the enemy as a place to shoot at the Korengal outpost from.
That's right. And so we've got and then there was a small little OP that there was several OPs surrounding the Korengal outpost on varying pieces of terrain. And so you've got this requirement to keep all those manned, and then muster enough folks to go out for patrols. And so we had the three platoons that were, our three platoons, one at Vegas, one at Restrepo, split time between the Korengal outpost, and then the third platoon that had responsibility for manning Dallas and the combat outpost. And there was another A&A company that was in that Firebase Vimoto with some of the Marines who are embedded training teams for them, basically doing an advise and assist mission. So that's kind of the lay of the land. And so from a manning standpoint, you've got a big requirement to man all of your bases, because you can't leave them unmanned when you go out on patrol. And so it was also always a challenge for us to balance how many people we brought out, because you want to have a big enough force to fight, because you're going to get in a fight.
And so what was the minimum manning for Restrepo when a patrol was out?
I don't remember. I was trying to go back and think about this, and I don't remember what it was. But Restrepo probably had 5 or 6 really good fighting positions with inside of the walls. I think there were 6 OPs that were surrounding the Korengal outpost, maybe 5. And most of them were manned by U.S., and there was, I think, 2 manned by
fire team at a time, maybe.
Two to 3 guys, yeah. And so on bigger missions, we would assume a little bit more risk, and maybe leave 5, 6, 7 guys, at Restrepo, up on those.
And Restrepo is out there too. So the picture I'm trying to paint is the fact that when we say base, Restrepo itself is really not a base. It was an observation post. It was a 2-squad observation post. Would sleep 2 squads, and when you went out a little heavy, you left 5 people at a base that it's not like someone could just run down the road to help them.
No, I mean, depending on the size of your house, the interior is like the first floor size of your house, maybe.
Yeah,
you know what I mean, and
small,
it's all HESCO.
small.
Yeah, there was enough room to sleep, a little bit of place to work out, and then and eat, and then your fighting
Yeah.
positions around the base. So anyway, that was always a big challenge is getting enough guys to go out to have the force you need to fight. But from talking about what the fighting was like, um, it was hard. It was hard fighting, and they tested us very early because they know that we're not as good, not nearly as good as the unit that's leaving when you're coming in, and so they're going to take advantage of that. We also wanted to push hard early, gain experience, get in better shape from living at that altitude and walking mountains every day. But we wanted to push the enemy back a little bit further and make our more regular, patrols that had taken battle company had been bigger operations. Our goal was to try to make a few of those more regular patrols, right, and gain a little bit more ground and be aggressive to do that. And so when we were out, we generally would know when we were going to get hit, right? The difference in this deployment was you felt more secure when you're on patrol, because they're going to hit you in a couple of times when you're extremely vulnerable, and when those are going to be. And so those are kind of challenging in their own right, but you'll get out. Sometimes you'll stumble into folks and you'll make contact really quick, but usually what happens is you go in, if you're doing an operation around a village or you're clearing some things, they're going to hit you on their way out because you've got two ways to go, either the highway or the low way.
Yeah, they watch you come in, they see the path you take, and they realize, yep, okay, they've got one or two routes out of here. Let's go ahead and set up on one or both of them. And so after the meeting with the village elders is done or anything like that, on your way back, they basically have the plan already for the route you're going to take back.
Yeah, and we talked about, Michael, if you're with your neighborhood friends and you go set up in your spots, right?
Yep.
So everyone's got their assigned spots based on where they live. And if you have more, foreign fighters or other folks that have come into the valley to help, then those folks kind of get pushed around too. And so depending on where you are, they will create essentially kind of a long ambush, and they'll try to hit you from just depending on how many people are out at the time they have to prepare. 1, 2, 3 positions, or sometimes 5 and 6, and so that's kind of on the patrol aspect. The other thing we talked about was the combat outposts and their desire to hit those, and they hit them a lot. And I remember Vegas. The first part of the time that we were there, they would get hit the most. There was a real concerted effort, I felt, to try to make a dent into Vegas. One, because it's so isolated, right? We could support them with artillery.
Other side of the valley.
Yeah, other side of the valley, but it's 4 hours to get over there, maybe, right? And so there's not going to be a ground force that's coming in very quickly. So that was always present on our mind. And there was a couple of times earlier, I think in August and September, they had a pretty good sized force. I think one of the, going back and doing a little bit of prep for this, I went back and looked at some of my notes, and some of the things I'd written down was one particular attack on Vegas. We estimated about 40 packs had hit them. And I'd gone back and I'd written down the amount of fire that we had used, but Vegas would get hit with indirect fire from recoilless or maybe a mortar system, a lot of small arms fire.
And Vegas had less, 40 people or less on the base. And so to say 40 people hit them, they're fighting an equivalent size force of their own.
Yeah, so 40 U.S. and there's probably an equivalent. I think there was 2 or 3 squads of A&A that were over there, Afghan Army folks that were over there. But yeah, I mean, it's just a lot of people. You don't typically get 40 folks that are hitting you. So they would also try to fix a lot of the other bases. And so if they were able to suppress the enemy, able to suppress the Korangal outpost and make it harder for us to shoot mortars, well, then that's less fire that can be on the bad guys that are trying to hit Vegas. And so they do the same thing with the mortar position at Vegas and try to fix that, and then get close to assaulting. But one of the notes I had is there was 5 guys that were within 25 meters of the wire, and so our guys, in addition to the direct fire, throwing hand grenades and hitting claymores and everything else. But I went back and I looked at our numbers, and I'd written down that we'd use 310 rounds of high explosive, either artillery or mortars. Vegas had shot 50 rounds. Blessing had shot 155 rounds of artillery, and then from the Korengal outpost, we'd shot 194 rounds of 120 ammo. And I think we had a handful of confirmed enemy KIA and wounded, and we thought there were more. But I mean, that shows the amount of artillery that we're shooting. And I think this was in August, right? And so I do remember that I had wanted to make a point with the enemy that we were going to fight. We were going to use a lot of HE to discourage these attacks getting overrun. And so probably later we wouldn't have shot that much artillery. But it just goes to the scope of how often that was happening. And it was happening a lot. I mean, that was one of the bigger ones.
And a 120 millimeter mortar round, for reference, it's funny we bring this up specifically, as I was the mortar platoon leader by that point in time on this deployment. I had taken the mortar platoon, and those were my mortarmen, and a 120 millimeter mortar round has about the same explosive capacity as a 155 millimeter artillery shell. And so you can generally classify them in the same category with regard to damage. But think about a half of a football field, football field cut in half right at the 50-yard line, and that is the kind of the radius of damage that one of those rounds is gonna put out. And inside of about a 25-meter radius, everything in that is dead. And so to fire hundreds of these rounds in a single day, number one, is no small task just to shoot them. It's physically arduous to get that many rounds out, but the amount of capacity for destruction in several hundred artillery or mortar rounds is pretty incredible. That's a huge fight. That's a huge firefight. Yeah,
it was hours. That fight was, and it's not just us, killing trees and rocks. We did kill a lot of trees and rocks, but the firing would stop and we'd think it was over, and then more guys would come and they keep trying to hit, and it just kept going. But I remember the early part of the summer, or the summer and the early part of the fall, there was most of the fighting was done over at Vegas, and it wasn't when they were on patrols. They just kept trying to hit the bases, and then it started to shift a little bit more to the rest of the valley. September and October were tough for us. I think it was 6 September was the first time that we had we'd taken casualties from engagements with the enemy. I remember on the 6th particularly, we had like 5 different fights that day, and they were all pretty decent sized fights. Second platoon was in the southern end of the valley, and one of the specialists, Marquez Knight, was killed. He was the turret gunner in one of the Humvees, and was hit and killed. And then shortly thereafter, Tom Gearhart and your old platoon was ambushed on their way back from a patrol in the high ground above Restrepo, and they had been hit.
He was blown off the side of the mountain.
Yeah, they had they're bounding back down, and the terrain is pretty treacherous, and so you've got to really kind of take your time and move slow, because you're going to fall off a mountain.
And there's open rock faces where the enemy can clearly see you from different vantage points that you have to cross, and there's a lot at play whenever you need to walk 100 meters up there.
Yeah, and so they had taken, that half of the element had taken an RPG right in the center, and it killed Private Dinnerman right away, but then 6 other folks were wounded, to include Tom, who was the platoon leader, and a bunch of other folks. And so they were kind of separated in a couple of different between the two elements, right? And they were the higher element. I think the other element was much below, or that didn't have. But that squad trying to react to the squad above them that had just gotten hit pretty hard, and so there was a big fight up there. And so that was a tough day. For the company, and so you talking to privates. I remember talking to a couple of different privates on the radio who were trying to describe the situation. Man, they did incredible. John Pinich, got a Silver Star for that particular event of leading as a team leader, leading his element to negotiate that, repel the enemy, push the enemy back, call in indirect fires on where the enemy was, take care of his wounded, get a medevac off the side of a mountain, and then a bunch of other guys. Talking to the forward observer, a private, or maybe a specialist at the time, who was trying to describe where the enemy was, asking for different resources. I mean, just an incredible amount of valor and effort that those folks.
They weren't speaking from experience; they were reacting and frantically getting stuff done in the most intense experience of their life at 20 years old.
Yeah, and man, real heroes, those guys. But I mean, that's at the end of the day, these guys are fighting for their friends, right? And so, you don't experience that fear as much in the fight, like with you personally. I mean, you're scared, you don't want to get shot, but there's more of a primal anger and a need to take care of your buddies who are hurt. And that's what folks fight for, and that's where they find courage. At least that's where I did. I know, but I mean, those guys are the ones that are doing the fighting. We're just trying to give them the assets that we need and put everything in the best position for them to win, and to help get out of a tough spot when they're in like that one. But the very next day, I remember the same guys are out there, right? So First Platoon, who had essentially lost a squad, 7 guys, either wounded or 1 killed, 6 wounded, 1 killed. We're out there the same next day, the exact same spot. Second platoon, who had just lost night, back there in the same day, getting right after it, right? Trying to 1, get your head right, but 2, push the enemy and say, hey, you're not going to push us back. I remember we had kind of smaller fights that day. And we were able to identify several different enemies. I remember writing on the 7th that we had 3 different PID and engage, which is when you positively identify the enemy and then engage him. It had dropped 8 GBUs, so 500-pound bombs to kill a handful of folks, which was good, trying to get that momentum back. But
it's a statement, but
yeah. But by middle of September, I think the company had about 15 casualties, killed or wounded, and so September was tough. And then right after that,
and that's 3 months into the deployment. So we arrived beginning of July, kind of did the relief in place through the middle of July, and then by the time the end of the month of July rolled around, we had complete control of the battle space from the unit we had replaced. And so we're talking 2.5, 3 months into the deployment at this point.
Yeah. And then, right after that, in the 3rd week of September, Staff Sergeant Cox, who was one of our squad leaders, and then Gonzalez were both killed in an IED strike on the Korengal Road. And so, you're starting in September. You lost 4 guys and taken a lot of casualties in a very, a 15-day period from the 6th to the 20th. And so that starts to kind of wear on guys right now. And so, I mean, anytime you lose a guy, it hurts, because he's somebody that you love. He's somebody that you care about. He's someone's friend. He's certainly a son and everything else. When we lost Cox, though, I mean, he was one of the best squad leaders in the company. And I know the privates looked at him, the way that you and I would look at kind of, a company commander or somebody.
He was a serious mentor in the unit.
Yeah. Not
just to guys in his squad either. I mean, he was kind of the shining light of what a squad leader is supposed to look like at that moment. And I remember the morale hit when he died was something that the entire battalion felt for months. I mean, and still feels. I still talk to people about, like, that's a huge moral defeat when you lose someone, and when you lose anyone, but when you lose someone who occupies a position of authority, who's an example that you point to, who soldiers look up to, and who was a mentor to young soldiers, that's a blow to a unit that's almost hard to quantify.
Yeah, it is. And I think that guys, they've said this to me, as you think about this, you're like, man, if he can be killed, then it could happen to anybody. And you realize that, as numbers start to kind of weigh on you, it wears on your mind. And in 1st Platoon and 2nd Platoon, I tell you what, I cannot credit the leaders of those organizations, the platoon leaders, the platoon sergeants, the squad leaders for taking their guys through. I think about Sergeant Young, I think about Sergeant Wright, particularly, because the platoon leader, the platoon leader's got all of the authority, right? But your platoon sergeant's got all the influence. At the end of the day, that's really what drives so much of that platoon. But I mean, both of those platoons took 50% casualties, and that's a lot, and that's and that wears on folks, and it makes it just it makes enduring harder, and their ability to navigate that and keep their guys' head in the game and to have the right attitude is just incredible.
For you, from your perspective too, you deal with this in two ways, right? Because you have to, as the leader, number one, you have to deal with the loss, right? The loss of a soldier that works for you, the loss of a soldier in your unit weighs heavily on you personally. And then you also have the job at hand. There's a real tactical fight that you don't get 4 days to go have a memorial service and go deal. You don't get any time. You lose someone and you might be in the middle of a fight, or the fight might pick up 30 seconds later, or there's no time. And somehow you have to process and move past this as, an individual, your own well-being and your own process of dealing with that. But as the leader, you have that and the responsibility to move the unit past this. And I'd imagine that gets pretty heavy when it starts to happen over and over again.
Yeah. It does. I mean, it's something that I know I struggled with throughout, but at the end of the day, you don't have an option, right? I mean, the enemy's going to be there tomorrow. One of the toughest periods for the company was in mid-October when Sergeant Penich was killed. We had a friendly fire incident, and we'd had it was a pretty big fight down in south of Restrepo. And we screwed up one of our mortar missions, and it landed and killed him and wounded 4 others. And like terrible doesn't begin to describe it. It is. I personally failed at the most basic fundamental responsibility of my job as a commander, of protecting your guys, right? And so your guys are at risk, and the enemy is going to inflict casualties, and when you do that to one of your own guys, it's there aren't words for it, but it tears at the fabric of trust that's within that company between leaders, right? Which is essential for combat. You've got to have that. Guys have got to trust each other. You don't have an option. Your guys have got to be experts. They've got to be good, and they've got to be there for each other. And they've got to be experts at their job. And so how do you overcome something like that?
Yeah. So that's my question: is how do you that incident, the casualties prior to that, losing influential leaders in the unit, and you're just one of multiple companies in the battalion that is experiencing these kinds of losses. There's only so many assets to go around. How do you move a company through that?
Well, I think what we did, it's not me. I mean, right. I mean, it's an entire team, and they take care of each other. And the approach we tried to take, with this particular incident is figure out what happened. Why did it happen? Fix what went wrong with it. Communicate that back out to the folks so that it doesn't happen again. But at the end of the day, and we've got to be ready. We're going to have a fight tomorrow. The enemy's going to be doing the same thing, and so we've got 8 more. We personally at that point had 8 more months to go, and so you use that, I guess, to kind of help focus the team. Guys, I can't tell you how many some of the senior NCOs really took care of me and other people. And everyone's just kind of there for each other, right? And you don't have an option not to be focused on what your mission is, because it's still there. The enemy is still there. So we're going to get back out on patrol and do everything you can to protect your guys, protect your positions, think about the mission, and keep going, because you still got a job to do. And for me, that's always there, right? you it does weigh. It weighs on you. It weighed on me a lot. And
I think the urgency of the task at hand is almost an asset to getting past that kind of stuff. Because at some point, everyone has their own process of getting through those things personally, and your own emotional situation. But when it comes to the effectiveness of the unit, the immediacy of the task at hand is absolutely going to move you forward, whether you've dealt with that and resolved your own issues with it or not.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. But at the day, it's for commanders and leaders, you balance yourself emotionally, because I think the biggest thing you can bring every day to your job and is your attitude and your ability to help focus and bring folks together and do that collectively as a team. And like you said, having the enemy looking at you in the face and that necessity certainly helps. But the thing that was different about this deployment, right, is you don't have that space to go back to, right? You're out on patrol, and when you're back at the outpost, you've got you're defending your home. You're going to be hit there. You don't know when. When you're going to get hit outside of the wire. You don't know when it's going to be back when you're inside. And so that that kept folks on edge. Because you're just less secure, and you're always kind of managing that.
I think there's something to that weighs emotionally as well. The environment that you're in when you go out on patrol and you're actively out on patrol, you have a pretty good idea of when you're going to get hit, and you can mentally prepare for that. And when you're defending your home, essentially you're defending your bed, not knowing when you're going to get hit, needing to be prepared for anything, understanding the casualties you've already taken and that's a risk in the future. Just that waiting and knowing and that uncertainty is it doesn't just weigh on people, it hurts over time,
Yeah, it does. And we talked about Vegas, and the threat that they faced early on in the deployment, but it was similar for the other outposts too. I remember, there's Restrepo. It did not. And there were a couple of close calls with Restrepo where folks got close and they had to employ claymores and other things. They had control of the terrain though, so that one was less of a concern for me. And it was a good place. It was a good place to fight from. Dallas, which was the OP a little bit further down, was always. It was essential to have it there as the fight, but it was close. The villages were nearby. There's enough space that they had claymores and grenades, and there were a couple of times that they had to use them. But there weren't very many blind spots. But that one, because it was so kind of far out there, everything was still in kind of mutually supporting itself. But each base had its own characteristics, and the guys I think will tell you that when you went out for a rotation out of Dallas, that was different. I mean, you're out there, it's the 9 of you guys, 10 of you on your own. You don't have a platoon, it's the squad leader that's out there. And so that, and when folks were out on some of the OPs around the outpost, it may take 5 minutes to get 10 minutes, 15 minutes to get up to you, not in a fight. And so the threat of folks sneaking in very closely and trying to breach was always in everyone's mind, and it weighed on those kids. I know it did. We had a couple of incidents with the Korengal outpost where folks would try to breach in the middle of the night and things, but it wasn't nearly as much of a fight there as it was in the other ones. So coming back home, you don't have that place to kind of rest mentally, which I think was challenging for the guys. But everything in the Korengal was hard. We talked about the the roads and the fights and everything else, the sustainment was arguably the hardest part there.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about the most dangerous things so far, but we haven't talked about just the simple aspects of how hard is it to take a shower, wash your clothes, get more bullets for your gun, and get food for lunch.
Yeah, it's hard. We So we talked about that IED on the road that Sergeant Cox and Gonzalez were killed on. There was a point in, and there were other folks. Whenever the battalion would come down for resupply, I mean, we were talking about this on the phone the other night, and it was 100%. The prediction was, okay, someone's going to get hit with an IED.
Yeah.
Right?
So talk about why. So at one point that road was closed as a result of those IED strikes, and if that
at one point, I'm sorry, go ahead.
So if that road is closed and you've got 100+ people there, close to 200, you add in the ANA, and you've got a couple hundred people with the Afghan National Army and U.S. forces there. You've got to keep them resupplied with ammunition. You've got to keep them fed. How does that work once the road is closed?
That's a good problem, or a good question. So you got more of a problem, and you're going to have to deliver it by air. And so, there was a period over November and December and January that we were relying on air a lot more, and we hadn't had a ground resupply, and I think it was about 3 months at one point in mid-January. Mm-hmm. And so we relied on primarily, U.S. helicopters would fly into the Kunar area, pick up supplies at the Pesh in the Pesh at Camp Blessing, fly it out to the combat outposts, either directly to the Korengal outpost or to Restrepo or to Vegas. We had one particular incident in January. We had a CH-47 that was delivering sling loads, and so. For the non-military types, it's like a basket, like a big net, and you'd have supplies in it, and the helicopter would go and they'd hover, and then whenever
dangling at the bottom of a long rope under the helicopter.
That's exactly right. And then whenever it's right over the landing zone, just right off the ground or touching the ground, then they drop the sling. And so doing that in the southern portion of the valley is dangerous. Because again, I mean, there really was like a line that you're just going to get in contact or you're going to run into the enemy. I mean, we know where all the fighting positions are.
Yep.
And there was a move to move more heavier supplies that we couldn't carry by ground, or to have a greater stockpile up at Restrepo at one point, and they were being slung in. And so one of the helicopters was hovering above Restrepo, about to drop a sling, and took an RPG. From the mountain, directly south of it. It shot it right into the side of the helicopter. And I remember I was inside of the talk, just monitoring what was going on, and you could hear all the gunfire. I mean, it just sounded like the southern end of the valley exploded with gunfire. And I ran outside. I was inside of the talk, and so it's hard to get a sense of exactly where it's coming from. And I think the XO was there, and there's enough folks on the radio. For immediate control for the first minute or so, and so I went out to get a sense of what was really going on, and you could hear better outside. Mm-hmm. And I ran outside, and kind of got up on this little outcropping that we could use to look in the southern end of the valley. It was right across and 5 feet outside of my door from the talk, and I saw the helicopter just flying down the valley with one of its engines on fire, and I could tell it's going down. And so we come back inside and very quickly to try to get the second platoon spun up to go do secure the crash site, and then hear on the radio that it had actually crashed. It tried to get over to Vegas and it crashed on their landing zone. So there were five. Go ahead.
And aside to talk about the almost unbelievable and clearly nearly impossible task that those pilots had to get that aircraft while it was on fire with an engine failing from the southern end of the valley to where they did outside of Vegas. That was the largest number of lives saved in any one incident, I think, on that deployment.
Yeah, I don't know how they did it. Because when a helicopter takes an RPG round, I mean that's
game
tough.
over.
Yeah. So they were able to slide it is probably the best way to say, very hard into the landing zone. I think it rolled over and caught fire, so the 5 crew were able to get out. There were 2 guys on there who were going back for R&R leave. Keith Jeter, who was a private specialist at the time, who had actually been in the Korengal with 10th Mountain Division, a few years prior, who, man, that everything that kid had been through was incredible. And then Ezra Dawson, one of our scouts, was on there. He was not able to escape and died in the crash. And so that happens. And then it's just a terrible experience, right? But from a logistics standpoint, as we're talking about that, it's there's the problem with the road. There's a problem now with the air resupply. That was technically the second bird that had gone down in the Korengal. There was while I was there was a contracting bird that had flown food in that had taken an RPG at some point over at Vegas, and it had crashed. So there's a pretty significant air threat from aircraft down. And so the point was earlier that everything was hard, right? And so getting ammunition in, especially mortar ammunition, food, fuel, parts, all those things were tough. I remember after that happened, right after that happened in on the 17th, a couple of days later, we made a big push down the southern portion of the valley to push the enemy back and try to regain momentum after they had a huge tactical victory of shooting down a helicopter. And we'd gone further over the subsequent rivers above the town of Darbart, taken back some terrain, had a really good engagement where we were able to kill a good group of folks that were on a little hill called Honcho Hill. We'd established these linear targets and kind of fire for effects boxes where we knew their fighting positions were. And there was no civilian activity on top of that portion. And we were able to use that really kind of for the first time there to mass effects over a good chunk of folks exactly where we knew they were going to be. And so we'd done that and right after, and gained a little bit of ground back. But then, the compounding problem of having no water, having no fuel. We hadn't had potable water, I think, in 3 weeks. And so we had taken our trucks. We were taking our trucks to go get water because we had a local national water truck and water driver who would go down to the river, get non-potable water, and then bring it up. But the truck was broken. Someone had murdered him, the local national, who lived in the little workers camp right outside of the village. We went down, and the 2 trucks we had were to get water. They broke down there, so we took our remaining 4 trucks out to get the 2 trucks back. Those broke down, and so we've got 6 trucks, all outside the water, trying to get food back up, or the water back up. It took like 10 hours to get them back, but I remember being extremely frustrated at this point because we had hoped there would be less fighting in the wintertime just to kind of give guys a break. There wasn't. The ground resupply was challenging. The air resupply was now more challenging. The casualties are mounting. You're low on food. You're low on 120 ammo. You're low on. We realized that we had mistakenly been calculating our fuel, and we really had no idea how much fuel we had, nor could we figure it out. And the 120s are your lifeline because once mortars start coming in, then you're able to really sway the tide, and we felt low on that. And so just kind of I remember that period of this kind of mounting pressure of just how hard it was to get things done, much less getting success with the villagers. But with all of that kind of mounting, and plus, and that's just that's with me. Not to mention the fact of all the risks these guys are putting out every day. I'm worried about logistics and some other things. They're every single day out on patrol, getting hit. Every day on patrol, getting hit back in their fighting positions out their outposts. So cumulatively, as a company, I think it starts to wear on folks that at a point. But at the end of the day, different leaders would turn to each other and they'd rally each other for support. And you say, hey, we still got a job to do, and you'd find inspiration in squad leaders or privates or team leaders that every day would just go out and just just inspire the heck out of you with the way that they led their guys and the way they cared for them and the way they taught them to be experts so that they could win a fight and protect each other. So despite how hard things were, that always gave me motivation. And I mean, that's what brings the company through events like that are those type of guys. And I felt extremely fortunate to have such good people that were working for me and with me.
I feel like that's where the real courage as a company commander comes from. It starts with the nervousness, and the worry that you are not going to be good enough, you are not going to be able to justify you being in the position and command of these people, and then you get to the point where you're down to business and it's time to go, and your obligation to those people around you, your desire to, as the commander, to do for the guys what needs to get done so that they can be successful. Everything else kind of falls to the wayside. Your fear of getting shot as a company commander. I don't remember. I was in plenty of firefights as a company commander, and I don't remember that many times being worried about getting shot. I was worried about the big fight. I was worried about at level. Who needs ammo? Who needs these assets? Who haven't I talked to in the last couple of minutes? Like that. Those are the worries and those are the fears in command. And it's this overwhelming pull to be able to take care of your people the way they need to be taken care of.
Yeah, I mean, I think whenever it's close. Like whenever you're getting shot and it's close, that was close, yeah. Right? But for the most part, you're hearing it. It's not as close. You're primarily worried about your guys, and in the moment, you got all that extra adrenaline that kind of pushes you through.
Yeah.
And so I think it folks usually think about that stuff later. Right, when you got downtime and nothing's going on, and you're like, man, that was close.
Oh shit! I'm not gonna tell my wife about that one.
Yeah, or hey, there's another big op that's coming. We got really lucky. We were doing an air assault raid on top of the Abascar, and it had gotten rolled 24 hours, and we had ISR because we were going to go that night. I don't remember why it got rolled 24 hours. I don't think it was weather. But we had some ISR, and we were able to identify a Dishka position which is a heavy machine gun, a Russian made heavy machine gun that was right on the LZ, and we were going to land right on top of it. And maybe we had picked it up before we went in, but we were able to destroy it the day prior. And so, you don't have that threat going in, but all those things, some of it's luck. You try to put yourself in the best position so that you can take advantage of those opportunities when you find them. But that's always weighing on folks' mind. And so it's balancing that, your own fear, finding courage in others, understanding your mission, figuring out how hard you're going to push, balancing that risk to mission versus risk to the force. For me as a company commander, I mean, that's what it's about, and that's what you're trying to do, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And then when you're done with that, at the end of the day, like you always go back, at least I do, and hey, did I do everything that I could, right? It goes back to that first example of failure, right, that I experienced as a football player when I got cut, and I didn't ask myself then at the time, like, hey, did I do everything that I could? Looking back now, I realize that I didn't. But at the time, I think when we left the Korengal, I said, I thought we did everything we could to prepare. I thought we could do everything that we could while we're there. You have these expectations of what you're able to achieve, and you're balancing that with what your objectives are. And so you look at how many more, a lot of folks have been upset about the Korengal closure, and you feel like it's not worth it, right? Sometimes, but you make the best decisions you can at the time.
Yeah.
And then you've got to ask yourself, okay, what are our objectives realistic? Do we really think we can accomplish our goals And if we still want to accomplish those goals, how much more force would it take to accomplish them? Is it worth putting another company or two in the Korengal to pacify the? Why? It's not. Maybe we just better isolate it and we focus. You can't disrupt the enemy everywhere. So choose and focus kind of where you want to go. At least that's where I got mentally. With kind of long term, at least my recommendation on things for the Korengal. But at the end of the day, you come back and you want to make sure you've done everything you can for your guys. I mean, that's what you got to live with, right? And so you want that. At least I did want that answer to be yes. And then afterwards, you want you hope your guys are going to be okay. I remember talking to folks as the deployment wrapped up and folks were leaving, like. It weighs on folks, and different guys have struggled, and it's a whole nother piece. But I tried to tell them I didn't want the Korengal to define them. Have it be a formative part of your experience, but don't let it define you. Right? Don't let something.
Your
like
life is not the Korengal Valley.
It's not.
Everything that happens after that doesn't have to be tinted by the color of the Korengal Valley.
That's right. That's right.
That's hard though, because. Even for me, so for my involvement, we didn't clarify this beforehand, but I changed out of the rifle platoon 6 weeks before the deployment, 2 months before the deployment, something like that, and took the mortar platoon. And so I spent probably a total of 4 weeks in the Korengal Valley on that deployment. Mm-hmm. And even for me, it's hard to have that be its appropriate percentage of my career. I spent 10 years in the military, and I spent 4 weeks in the Korengal.
Yeah.
But those 4 weeks in the Korengal, and that year just outside of in the Pesh River Valley, going from base to base and firefight to firefight, it's hard to not let that be a bigger percentage of that time than it was, because it was so extreme in so many ways.
Yeah, it really is, and you also get a sense of what people can endure and what you get used to. I thought it
blew me away week after week after week.
Yeah, I mean it's after all of that, if you do anything long enough, right, you can get used to it. And so, despite all of those challenges, how hard it was on folks, I remember like the weeks after, like, so it's the only thing I thought about, and you kind of missed it a little bit because it was part of your life, and folks will even say now, you reconnect or stay in contact with soldiers, and you get this camaraderie there and it's not the fighting that you necessarily miss, but it's the camaraderie you get with your guys.
Yeah, the enduring.
Yeah, I mean, you've got guys that are fighting every day for each other. They're trying to protect each other. They're becoming experts at what they do, and they're doing it to protect their friends. So that's to me, that's what people miss. At least that's what I miss. There's something exhilarating about getting shot at and not dying, right? I mean, there's something to that.
It's impossible to replicate kind of. It's hard to describe. It's hard to. I struggle with that because there were moments in my career, one in particular, where I stepped out into a road and to get a better vantage point on a firefight that we were in, stepped down onto a road to look at, and I was literally just looking for muzzle flashes because I thought I had a good idea of where they came from. And 150 meters down the road, an insurgent stepped out to shoot at me, and I didn't even see him. Some of the men in my company that I were with shot and killed that guy, but he got some shots off in my general direction from about 150 meters away, and that experience afterwards, it feels good in a very strange way, like that. It's an exhilarating feeling, a feeling of success, i.e. he tried and failed, and so there's a victory in there somewhere, right? So there
is. You feel invincible. You feel like you're especially when you're a company, man, there's nothing more awesome than bringing a platoon or a company's worth of firepower down on the enemy. I mean, that is just awesome. Yeah, I mean, and as infantrymen, that's what you do, right? And so when you're able to do that, there is this elation that you get. So there's an aspect of that, but I think folks will tell you that at the end of their career, they're okay not having that, but you miss the camaraderie.
Absolutely.
And
I'm okay with never getting shot at again, but I can't suffer not speaking to my soldiers.
That's
My
right.
former soldiers
That's
ever
right.
again.
And the other piece of that is when you talked about what people can endure, you also realize how important family and friends are to that process, right? The only thing I thought about, I think, in the Korengal, aside from fighting, was my family. And when you go through that, or any deployment, or whenever you're away, you always have that greater appreciation for how special and important family and friends are to you as a person. And for me, to be able to navigate past that or through that, and you come out on the other end, you continue on with life. If it wasn't for my family, I don't know. They're the ones that help me navigate that process. And when I think back to with soldiers, where I worried is with folks that didn't have that community. If they were their family was further off, they didn't have that connection, or you're moving to another unit without that core group of folks. It's just how important those relationships are to putting everything in perspective, right? And allowing folks to kind of get on with or get past things that have been very troubling and hard for them. You couldn't do it without your family, and the amount that those folks, your family, endures for what you do. You can do a podcast, man. Get some military spouses on here. Talk about some perspective and some courage and some fear that they have to manage. At least in the Army, you're able to control the situation, right? They're doing that so often on their own. I am in, military families and spouses are heroes of mine as much as soldiers are for the things that those folks endure. But when you're in those circumstances, it just, again, to kind of bring it back, it just shows you how important those relationships are.
That I had the exact same worries as, I didn't find myself. I wasn't worried about myself. I knew I was coming back, what kind of family situation that I was coming back from that deployment, and then subsequent deployments, the deployment where I commanded a company as well. I worried about the folks that were coming home to an empty apartment.
Yeah.
But and that those support systems, I think, are the reason. That's the process of moving on from intense experiences like that, and finding peace with did or did you not do everything that you could. Were your motivations for doing certain things the right ones? Those hard questions that you deal with, going back and questioning decisions that led to outcomes you didn't feel were best, or that in some situations turned tragic, or a firefight where something happened that was a tragedy that you had no control over. Moving through those kinds of experiences and then on from those kinds of experiences, that's not done inside your own head. That's done with the people around you.
Yeah, but you're absolutely right. And you want to take those things and you want to use those experiences to help shape future folks that you work for, or you work with, or work for you. Not just tactically. You obviously want to do that, but the things you've got to do to kind of get your head right. But at the end of the day, like, it's the thing that I keep coming back to and this isn't novel to anyone that's in the service, but just how incredible soldiers are, and how much of a team they can build with each other, how much trust and expertise they have, and they use that to get through the tough times. They use that to accomplish the mission, regardless of how challenging it is. And so, for me, I've always got heroes of mine, either from 10th Mountain Division or the Ranger Regiment, or in Viper Company in 126, from that Korengal deployment, or other positions and assignments that I've been in that, I always either kind of want to emulate the things that I can take from them that help me, or just the example that they gave me. And it's at all different levels, from privates to sergeants to, I tend to go back to the NCOs a lot more, because man, those guys they're inspiring. And the amount that they dedicate to just making their folks so good. It's humbling. And so at this point, we talked about when first kind of coming in, and I've got 15 years in the Army at this point. Maybe longer than that, 16.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, foreseeably you can retire in a few years, and that's what you miss about it. That's I know what I would miss about it, but it's that's what I want to take, or try to take and impart into folks, in your next duty assignments, and try to emulate those great examples that you have seen from all those different circumstances back into life.
Well, I can't really think of a better point to finish up this conversation on. And we've got battalion command here coming up pretty soon. The next major leadership position for you in the Army, and that's we'll have to have you come back and talk about what it's like being a senior level commander in the Army. It's a little bit strange to me to think about that. My first company commander taking a battalion.
Yeah, it goes quick. No, I appreciate it, Michael. I definitely will come back on a whole new set of challenges.
Yep.
The unique thing about a battalion commander, though, is you've got so much talent below you that, I mean, it kind of makes things easy, right?
It's almost astonishing, the amount of talent in a battalion.
It is.
Yeah.
It really is. So
we'll have Stephanie and Kristen come on one time and explain the real hard part of being in the military.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Those two can certainly
they can lay it down what it's really like.
Yeah.
Well, all right. This has been awesome. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Same here, brother.
That's it for this episode of the Fear and Courage podcast. As I mentioned at the beginning, on the next episode, I interview Sam Dean, former infantry officer and current U.S. congressional candidate. Thanks for listening.